that, we will launch the final session of Origins, which is by Peter Payne, Order of Nature Miracles versus Specific Point Miracles, a key distinction in the science versus Christianity to debate. So Peter, it's all yours.
Back in 2011, I gave a talk for the ASA entitled, "Does the Success of Science by Itself Provide Strong Support for Naturalism?" I actually raised in passing the concepts of order of nature miracles and specific point miracles, but here I want to focus on those and underscore their importance for thinking about the question of whether the success of science is evidence for naturalism or whether, in fact, it is not. I also want to underscore that when I talk about the success of science, there's two aspects of that. One part of it is the success in explaining the order of nature, giving the outlines of how things work. And then there's the aim of science to try to explain individual events. And science has had a great deal of success in both of those directions. Next, I need to clarify some terms. By miracles, in both of my kinds of miracles, I'm using in the strong sense. Namely, it's events brought about by God, which involve, which are exceptions to genuine laws of nature, i.e. to the intrinsic order of nature itself. Order of nature miracles are miracles needed to sustain the order of nature. Specific point miracles are miracles for specific purposes, not that of sustaining the order of nature. And I should say something about the order of nature. The order of nature, actually, we think of it as being what the laws of nature describe. But if one is going to consider seriously the idea of specific point miracles, you have to include the possibility that there's an order of nature which God sustains miraculously in addition to that which is described by the laws of physics themselves. I'll give a couple examples of order of nature miracles and specific point miracles, and that'll help clarify what I'm talking about. Isaac Newton thought that God every once in a while needed to adjust the orbits of the planets. The reason he thought that was he thought that the planets' gravitational effect on each other would destabilize them. Now, if in fact God needs to adjust the orbits of the planets to keep them stable, that would be an order of nature miracle. Another example is cellular differentiation. Cellular differentiation looks at how it is when a cell divides, it sometimes becomes a different cell than the parent cell. A stem cell can become a muscle cell, a nerve cell. A nerve cell can become a different kind of nerve cell, the nerve cells, than the parent cell. And the question is, how does this take place? I once heard a preacher say that science is unable to account for cellular differentiation. In his view, it says God has to be involved in this process that we see within nature. Well, if in fact he were right, I don't think he was, but if in fact he were right, that would be an order of nature miracle. As you might think from what I'm suggesting, actually, I think there probably are no order of nature miracles, but that's how that's defined. Specific point miracles consider either the virgin birth of Jesus or Jesus' resurrection. Either way, these events, I think, are exceptions to the laws of nature. There's no way in which a virgin birth can take place given the laws of nature. There's no way it's going to take place in accordance with Jesus' resurrection, in accordance with the normal laws of physics and biology. But at the same time, they have no implications whatsoever for the sustaining the order of nature that we see around us. So the question becomes, what does the success of science tell us? What does the success of science in explaining the order of nature tell us? And I would suggest it actually does tell us that there are no gaps in the order of nature, or at least it pushes things pretty strongly in that direction. A lot of the God of the gaps arguments were arguments saying science can't explain this part of the natural world, that part of the natural world. Well, it seems to me that the success of science tells us that there likely are no order of nature miracles. There are no gaps in that sense. Now, is this a problem for biblical Christianity? People oftentimes assume, well, if God's not doing all these things, then God doesn't do anything. In fact, people oftentimes assume that the source of belief in God to begin with was not understanding how the natural world worked. So therefore, one posits that God caused it to rain, or the spirits cause it to rain. But in fact, that's not true of Jewish and Christian faith. Their foundation for their faith was how God worked in history in specific kinds of ways. But it's not a problem for biblical Christianity because a gapless order of nature is not only compatible with biblical Christianity, it also accords well with it. Now, I need to elaborate a bit on this because that's an important claim. So a gapless order of nature is not only compatible with biblical Christianity, it accords well with it. Start off with the character of the world that's created according to Scripture. It's not animistic. It's not pantheistic. Not being animistic means God did not create a world that is run by spirits. Nor is it pantheistic. The world is not an extension of God. It's not as though things in the world are like appendages of God, which he manipulates as part of his body. No, the world is not God in a biblical view. The world is created by God and has this separate existence from God himself, even though he sustains it moment by moment. The earliest pioneers in science, most of whom were Christians, did not feel at all threatened by discovering order within the natural world. For them, discovering order in the natural world simply bore testimony to the wisdom and power of God in creation. Now, if in fact Christians and Jews had thought that God exists because he makes it rain, then for people to come up with explanations for why it was raining, you would have within the church be, oh no, that can't be. But no, those weren't the kind of issues that arose. They all recognize that God has created a world that has intrinsic powers within it, and as we can discover what those are. Next, the character of God. God is both all-powerful and all-knowing. An implication of this is that if God's all-powerful, I presume he can create any possible world. And if he's all-knowing, he knows all the possibilities. Well, clearly one possibility is the world we see around us, where there are no gaps in the order of nature. And the question is, would such a God choose to create a gapless order of nature? Now, it's really not an easy question to answer because we are not God. When we start saying, well, this is what God would do if I were God, we oftentimes get ourselves into trouble because we're not God, and God is quite radically different than us. But nonetheless, from a human perspective, suppose an engineer is designing something, and he can either design it where he needs to adjust it on an annual basis, or he is designing something which would be self-adjusting, creating something which is self-adjusting, doesn't need outside input to keep it going. From a human standpoint, seems like a much more elegant solution. So I guess, at least from a human perspective, the idea that omnipotent, omniscient God would create a gapless world should not be a surprising consequence. Third, there's the idea that God sustains the world. Now, one might think God sustaining the world means that God's involved in the world in order of nature miracles. But no, it doesn't. It simply means God sustains the order of nature itself. So God sustaining the world is perfectly compatible with there being no order of nature miracles. The doctrine of divine sovereignty is more complicated than that. People wrestle with what exactly that means. But I would maintain that it does not mean that God directly, miraculously makes every natural event happen just as it does. When you ask the question, why did the coronavirus take place? Why are we in the pandemic that we're in? People oftentimes are saying, well, what purpose did God have? God willed this, as if God is the one who directly made this happen. And I think God created a world within which these things happen, and God, in his sovereignty, let that unfold. Now, why he didn't intervene is a different question, but nonetheless, the idea of divine sovereignty does not mean that God does not create a world which runs according to the principles and laws which God has created. Next, arguably, all the miracles in the Bible, strong sense of miracles, are specific point miracles. So if you say, well, surely God does order of nature miracles, look through the Bible. All the reported miracles, I think, arguably are miracles that are specific point miracles and not order of nature miracles. And I say arguably because there's some questions in how one interprets text. So, for instance, Deuteronomy 11:44 says, God, will give the rain for your land in a season, and the early rain and the later rain, and that you may gather in your grain and your wine and your oil. What it doesn't say is how God does this. It doesn't say that God is miraculously causing it to rain in the fall when you need it, causing your plants to grow, but rather God does this, but it doesn't say how God does it. So it's very easy for us looking back on and interpreting it to say that God does this through the order of creation that he's made. He's created a world within which rains do come at the times that are needed for harvest. Not every time, but nonetheless, God has built that into his creation. Second here. Okay, so the text does not address how God does things. Rather, there is provision by God in his created order. A key point in my claim that all the miracles in the Bible are specific point miracles, the Bible never states that ongoing aspects of the observed order of nature are sustained by miracles. That's never affirmed within Scripture itself, even though I think oftentimes authors may have thought that every time it rained, every time there was lightning, every time the sun rose, that God was doing it. And they may have thought that God was directly doing it in some miraculous way. But in fact, there's no clear teaching of Scripture anywhere that says that these things are brought about by God supernaturally making them happen, rather than God creating a world within which they happen. Now I want to turn to success of science, talking about individual events. So what does the success of science addressing individual events tell us? One, it tells us that nearly all individual events are naturally caused. It's hard to come across an event which, this couldn't be naturally caused. So science looks around and has a great deal of success in accounting for individual events. It also implies, the success of science implies that obvious specific point miracles, if they occur, are rare. After all, if obvious specific miracles happen all the time, then scientists would have lots of instances. Okay, well, we can't count this, this, and this, and this, and this. Lots of cases where they say we don't have any good explanation for it. Where they say, okay, that might be a specific point miracle. But if in fact God does them rarely, then scientists simply aren't going to see those. I mean, for myself, people ask me, when have I seen a miracle? Well, I ask, are you talking about when I've seen God at work? I could tell you things where I think I've seen God at work. But where I think God has done an exception to the laws of physics, where I'm confident about that, no, I don't have that within my own experience, obvious exceptions. So obvious miracles in the Bible actually are not common. Oftentimes Christians think God does miracles all the time and he can do any kind of miracle he wants. But when one looks through Scripture, obvious miracles are almost always connected with particular individuals or particular times. And the vast majority of biblical history do not have obvious miracles within them. And one might remember that when Jesus asked to do obvious miracles sort of on command, he refuses to do that. So what does the success of science in explaining individual events, what does it not show us? I would maintain that it does not show us that specific point miracles cannot take place. There's no good argument that says there's a gapless order of nature to saying that God never does miracles on specific occasions for specific purposes. Nor does it tell us how much evidence is needed to believe in a miracle report. It's oftentimes assumed you have to have this extremely high amount of evidence. But in fact, there's nothing within the success of science that tells us that that's the case. I mentioned two quick objections. One objection is the scientific investigations into miracle reports show one should not trust miracle reports. Actually, that simply tells us there are going to be a lot of false miracle reports out there. Plus, finding many reports named to be false, namely the events either didn't occur or they can explain in terms of laws of nature, is to be expected whether or not there are genuine miracles. Next, if there's a scientific investigation done on genuine miracle, it's not going to come up with a conclusion, a miracle occurred, or even, possibly a miracle occurred. Rather, from a scientific standpoint, the answer will be unresolved case. From a perspective of science, you don't declare miracles happen. You simply say what science can or cannot tell us. So consider a scientific investigation reports of miracles. You're going to have things in the column not a miracle, and you'll have things in the column of unresolved, but you're not going to have anything in the column of miracles. So the investigation of miracle reports really tells us nothing about whether genuine miracles can happen or actually have happened. Another objection is that no actual miracle report has sufficient evidence to warrant belief in it. Now, in response to that, a fairly high bar of need is needed to filter out false reports. But there's no clear criteria from science or elsewhere as to how high the bar should be set. And some miracle reports are backed by a considerable amount of evidence. So I would maintain that the resurrection of Jesus is backed by a considerable amount of evidence. So there's a danger of circular reasoning when a person raises the objection. If the bar is extremely high, and the reason is a conviction that miracles cannot happen, this is circular reasoning. So an absence of order nature miracles is not good reason to believe that specific miracles cannot take place. Also, there's a fallacy in believing that that miracles are less probable than all possible natural causal explanations. So I sometimes sort of say you shouldn't believe in a miracle unless all possible natural explanations are eliminated. But there are some natural explanations that are extremely unlikely, and why believing a miracle took place should be overrun by any of those, trumped by any of those, doesn't make sense to me. Also, it remains possible that arguments not arising from the success of science might eliminate supernatural agency as a viable alternative to natural law explanations. in which case you would set a bar very high. The present claim is just that the success of science by itself does not strongly support naturalism. And when one brings in these other things, they're actually not conclusions from the success of science by itself. So the success of science and with individual events does not tell us that miracles cannot take place, nor does it tell us how high the bar of evidence needs to believe they've taken place. Thank you. Questions? Yeah,
about 3.5 minutes for questions. I'm not seeing any hands jump up. I'll go ahead and ask a question. So many people would describe miracles of occasions where God has intervened in their life personally, not in nature per se, but they felt like an angel directed them to this, or they brought something in their life. How would you incorporate that kind of a miracle into your larger conversation?
Well, I believe God does that. The question is, how does he do that? So when a person has a thought that leads them to think about Christ, or a thought that leads them to look in Scripture, a thought that leads them to think more about the Christian faith, where does that thought come from? Now, it may just be there are natural explanations. Their brain just would have come about that thought in any case. But it's also possible that God is in micro miracles, one might say, actually causing thoughts to arise in their brain, which they wouldn't have had otherwise. So I'm really quite open to the idea that God works through micro miracles, because I think that our thoughts really are connected to brain events. And if they're connected to brain events and God is going to guide my thoughts, he's going to have to influence brain events.
All right, Jay, you have a question. Holloman.
Have you done any research regarding the Catholic miracles that are associated with sainthood? Those are very carefully investigated. And, a saint has to have two before he can become a saint. People praying for the dead, obviously, praying for the... Have you looked at that?
Well, it's a little strange to me that sainthood would be connected with supernatural powers, but the Catholic Church makes that connection. But when they raise these cases and raise the evidence, it's possible that they have some. There are even skeptics who say, oh, wow, I hadn't realized there's such a good case for it. But I suspect that it depends on testimony of what people said, and there's always room for doubt of people having. It's not obvious for the skeptic. So the question is, why doesn't God do obvious miracles more often? And I think that's a very good question. But it's quite clear to me from the Bible that God doesn't do obvious miracles very often.
All right, we got time for one quick last question by Kirk.
Yeah, Peter. So you've made great pains to distinguish God's providence in nature from these order of nature miracles, but it seems to me they're very similar. Could you flesh out the difference a little more clearly?
Well, the difference is divine providence. God have set up processes, which in fact are for our benefit, for the running of the world. In fact, one asks, what evidence is there for God? The fact that the processes work so well, that all come about by chance from a mindless universe. It seems to me, no, God set up the universe in a way in which the life as we know it can exist. So it seems to me that divine providence manifests itself in that way. But also it's quite clear to me that God actually does work through events, where sometimes things will happen in my life that seem to be providence in what it's just surprising that would take place. Now, is it the case that God set that up from the beginning of time, that when this would take place, the laws of nature would have that happen in my life? Or is God doing something, sort of nudging events to that direction? And I'm quite open to the idea that God is nudging things in that direction rather than simply saying that providence can explain all the details of the seeming orchestration of events that we see in our lives, for example.
All right, that wraps up the final session and this session on origins. Thank you all for attending and for our three speakers.